Thank you for being here. Joining me today is Finance Director Elizabeth Hannan, and together we'll present the fiscal year 2018 proposed budget for the City of Urbana. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of staff in the Finance Department, Sophie Pham, Don Ho, and Chris Francisco, all department heads and chiefs and their respective staff members, and Mike Munson, Chief of Staff. The budget presentation today focuses on the general fund, from which we pay the bills for the daily operation of the city. The complete budget is posted on the city's website, and a printed copy for viewing is available in the city clerk's office. So the proposed budget represents a shift in financial perspective with a more realistic appraisal of our finances in the City of Urbana. The City of Urbana is taking the difficult but necessary steps to build a foundation for the future through financial transparency, accountability, and practical steps to improve the city's financial position going forward. I also want to ensure employees and the public that we intend to face our challenges head-on so that we can continue to provide necessary services and programs and to position ourselves for growth. As you know, the recent state Supreme Court decision to send the hospital property tax issue back to the Circuit Court was a significant financial setback for the City of Urbana. This put us in a position closest to the worst-case scenario in our financial forecast, short of outright losing the case. The city is now receiving approximately $1.2 million less on an annual basis. In addition, we're facing several serious concerns about long-term budget issues, including funding for police and fire pensions, which currently is more than $1 million short of the recommended amount. We're facing a structural deficit in the general fund, which pays for most day-to-day operations in the city, including police, fire, and most public works activities. And we must also address years of inadequate investment in the city's infrastructure, our streets, sidewalks, streetlights, and storm sewers. And we have to consider potential fallout from the state's ongoing budget crisis. Given this background, it's probably not surprising that this budget includes a number of reductions and very few new expenditures. I'd like to give a little background, our economic and financial background, before we get into the details of the budget. And it's actually the good news, a lot of good news about our community. The vitality of the City of Urbana and actually this entire area is inextricably linked to the economic and financial outlook of our largest employers. The University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign is the largest employer. It anchors our economy. It had a 2017 payroll of almost $1 billion and 44,800 students from across the country and around the world. The healthcare sector is the second largest employment sector in Champaign County, with about 8,000 people on the payroll. Carle Foundation Hospital's main campus in Urbana alone employs about 3,500 people and brings 2,500 to 3,000 visitors daily to the City of Urbana. Many other factors impact our financial outlook. The U of I's Flash Index shows that the state economy is growing modestly. Property assessments in Urbana increased by 4.5% for the 2016 tax levy, which was the first real growth in assessments since 2009. This growth was driven by increases in existing property values, as well as by $27.3 million in new construction on the tax rolls. 2 major student housing complexes were completed. They include Campus Circle with 181 units and Next to Campus Apartments with 84 units. The Champaign-Urbana metro area unemployment rate is 4.5%, which is slightly lower than the state's rate of 4.9%. And finally, the City of Urbana has very little debt. We have $6.44 million in general obligation debt outstanding. If no new debt is issued, the city will be free of debt by the end of fiscal year 2023. So that's a strong background for the message and the budget that we're about to present today. And finally, we do have some major economic development tools at our disposal that were put into place last year. These include the Central Tax Increment Financing District, the TIF district, which now has 5 active agreements in place, leveraging $4 million in investment. And our new enterprise zone now has 13 commercial projects underway with a private investment of $7.6 million, providing 120 new jobs. Plus, we currently have 56 new single-family and duplex housing units started. These kinds of development tools are critical to building out our subdivisions and stimulating infill development in the city of Urbana. So, our budget today and our presentation today focuses on the general fund. And again, that's the fund from which we pay bills for the daily operation of the city. In recent years, the city has used a number of short-term strategies to balance the budget. These included taking money from the Vehicle and Equipment Replacement Fund, called VERF, to balance the general fund budget, deferring payment, the full payment of the annual MedCAD fee, which supports the countywide emergency 911 system. We reduced funding for police and fire pensions from what's recommended by our actuary to the minimum required by state law. And we all know what a slippery slope that can be. And costs for various services were shifted to other funds. We won't continue this practice because we're digging ourselves into a hole. We have to have a balanced and fiscally sustainable budget, and this is going to require thoughtful, strategic decision-making over the next few years. Some cuts are included in this budget, and more will be necessary. As the first step in budget transparency, we're moving $5.26 million in disputed hospital property taxes, which we've collected. It'll be moved from the general fund balance to the general reserve fund. This gives a more accurate picture of our true financial position. This entire amount potentially could be paid back to the hospitals. It's not ours to spend at this time, and it should not be presented as such in our budget. What this means is that our reserves actually are lower than the level required by our city's financial policy, which is 15% of recurring expenditures. In this proposed budget, our ending fund balance for fiscal year 18 is projected to be 12.5% of recurring expenditures, which is still a shortfall of $800,000. More adjustments will be required in fiscal year 19 to rebuild our reserves. And these reserves are becoming increasingly important. These are the city's rainy day fund. We would draw on these reserves in the event of a natural disaster like the tornado we had a few years ago, or a financial emergency created in Springfield, which the longer the budget impasse goes on and the crisis remains unresolved, that's becoming more and more likely that the state will turn to the cities for funding. The budget today contains a couple of significant initiatives. One is that we will fill the position of city administrator. That will bring professional management to the city of Urbana. The administrator will focus on economic development, long-term planning, and implementation of the goals and policies of the mayor and city council. The recurring cost for this position is about $190,000. This includes salary, benefits, memberships, professional development. We'll also begin the first phase of the Programming and Space Needs Assessment and Facility Plan in order to provide a framework for decision-making in the coming years. Total cost of the facility study is estimated at $150,000 to $175,000 over a 2-year period. Today's budget includes $75,000 for the first phase. There are a few other new expenditures, but very few. We propose to partially restore funding to the Champaign County Economic Development Corporation to previous levels with a contribution increase of $9,600. Fire station ventilation systems will be modernized and funded from the retained risk fund for $93,000. We are proposing no wage increase for management and most professional employees. We have proposed very modest increases for union and lower wage non-union employees. There are several much needed infrastructure improvements that will be funded in the coming year. Construction on the MCOR project will continue on Green Street in Urbana from Wright Street to Busey Avenue. This is part of a comprehensive intergovernmental effort to transform the heart of campus and provide connectivity from campus to downtown Urbana. It really will be a transformative project. The total cost for the city is $1.5 million over 2 years. A shared use path will be constructed on Cunningham Avenue between Kenyon Road and Napleton Way, with the city's share totaling $185,000 from the TIF 4 fund. This will provide a safe way for pedestrians and bicyclists to travel between home, workplace, and commercial areas. And several much-needed street resurfacing projects will be completed in fiscal year 2018 using either local or state motor fuel taxes. These include Vine Street from Main Street to University Avenue, Lincoln Avenue from Green Street all the way up to Saline Court, which is north of I-74, Springfield Avenue from Gregory Street to Kohler Avenue. This is my personal favorite street to have resurfaced. And Race Street from Washington Street to California Avenue. These are all high-profile, heavily used streets about which we get many complaints on a regular basis. And the surfaces truly are in lousy condition. So we are grateful to be able to get this work done in the coming year. There will be some revenue adjustments. We are proposing to increase the local food and beverage sales tax to 1.5%. It's currently at 1%, which will generate an additional $390,000. This tax is imposed upon prepared food for immediate consumption and alcoholic beverages. And there are some other increases in some of the other fees. Thank you. 2.5% increase in the sewer use fee, which will generate an additional $39,000. 2% increase in the stormwater fee, which will generate an additional $30,000. A 2.5% increase in recycling tax for $15,000. Last week at council, we had discussed increasing the parking meter rates on campus, but that will not be occurring this year. So our parking meter rates will remain the same as the U of I's and the City of Champaign's in the campus area. So the budget also contains a number of reductions. A complete list of budget reductions is provided in the budget message, and I'll just discuss some of them here. The planned transfer of $2.7 million over 3 years to correct the deficit in the VERF fund, the Vehicle and Equipment Replacement Fund, is going to be extended to 15 years, beginning in 2017, fiscal year 2017, which would reduce spending from $897,000 to $180,000. So we'll just take longer to pay that fund back. The Mayor's Chief of Staff will retire in early summer. That position will not be filled, with $110,000 going to hire the City Administrator. Director of Community Development Services will retire as of June 30th, and the department will be reorganized with a net savings of approximately $140,000. The general fund support for the Urbana Business Association will be reduced from $28,000 to $14,000. The UBA receives substantial support from TIF funds and support for specific events. So this is simply the amount coming from the general fund. And likewise, general fund support for public arts is reduced by $15,000. Public arts largely is funded from TIF funds, and there is a balance of about $51,000 in the fund as of projected for the end of fiscal year 18. So again, the general fund support is going to be reduced, but both UBA and public arts are largely funded from our TIF funds, and that will continue. We're going to maintain the same level of spending on social services as last year, which was about approximately $250,000, which came from the City of Urbana General Fund and Cunningham Township. In this year's budget, there's a 1-year reduction of $25,000 in general fund support, and that's due to the fact that there's about $26,000 left unspent from last year. So our overall support for social services will be maintained. One of our major goals is to reduce the city's dependence on the use of outside counsel and eventually bring labor negotiations in-house, certainly for the next negotiating cycle. Therefore, the special counsel budget in the mayor's office has been reduced by $35,000, and an additional $50,000 has been moved to the legal division for closer monitoring on the use of outside counsel. And again, the goal is to reduce our currently heavy reliance on the use of outside counsel. The mayor's travel budget will be reduced by $5,000. We're going to modify yard waste, leaf pickup, and Christmas tree collection to reduce the cost by about $20,000. We will maintain those services, but the number of pickups will be reduced slightly. So this is a partial list of budget reductions. There's a complete list provided in the budget message. And Elizabeth Hannan will now provide many more details on the budget.
So I'll just run through a few charts for you here. This first chart shows you total revenues for all city funds. So this is everything combined. And you'll note that the blue portion on the bottom is the general fund, and the green portion at the top is other city funds. So this has fluctuated considerably, but that's largely due to various one-time revenues. The thing that probably jumps out the most is that between FY16 and FY17, the general fund revenues have actually declined. That's very concerning, and that is largely due to declining receipts from sales and income tax. Some of that is related to one-time revenues, but about 1.2 million is just a revenue shortfall. The reason for the increases in other funds is largely due to the timing of receipt of revenues in various capital improvement funds. We get a lot of money from the state and federal government, and the timing is sometimes dependent on, it's a reimbursement basis, so it just depends on the timing of the expenditures. So looking at expenditures for all city funds, this chart shows expenditures by classification. As you can see, most of the fluctuation is up there. I'm having a hard time moving this mouse. Is up there at the top in that purple portion, which is capital expenditures. And again, that tracks with what I said about revenues. A lot of the fluctuation has to do with sort of one-time expenditures, especially in capital improvement funds. We will often set aside money for several years, for many years, in order to fund big improvements that will occur within a short span of 1 or 2 fiscal years. There's a larger blip in the green portion way back in FY15 for expenditures that stands out. And that is related to the disbursement of $11.6 million from TIF 3 to the overlapping tax districts. That payment was made at the very end of fiscal year 15. And just to note, in FY18, personnel costs are about 57% of expenditures for all city funds. So most city expenditures are for staff. Looking a little more closely at general fund revenues by source, you can see that we expect $33.4 million in general fund revenue next year. Sales tax is far and away the largest source of revenue in the general fund. It's about 28% of all revenues. This is very concerning since our sales tax revenue has not been performing well. We're expecting that our sales tax revenues in the current fiscal year, so the year that ends June 30, 2017, will decrease by about 2.5% compared to the prior year, and we're only expecting about 1% growth in FY18. So as you can see, with that being a very large part of our revenues, that's a concern. Property taxes are about 13% of general fund revenues, but that is threatened by tax caps that have been proposed from time to time in the General Assembly as part of balancing the state's budget. Most property tax revenue in the general fund actually doesn't stay in the general fund. A little more than half is actually passed through directly to our police and fire pension funds. Income tax is the next largest source of revenue, about 12% of general fund revenue. Again, this is a state shared revenue, and there have been various proposals in the legislature to reduce the local government share by anywhere from 25 to 50%. As the mayor said, the longer the budget crisis goes on, the more likely that they're going to lean on local governments to balance the state budget. A 50% reduction in income tax would be a $2 million annual loss in revenue to the city. As the mayor mentioned, our complete budget document is online, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. There's an entire section devoted to discussion about some of our major revenues. So focusing on the general fund, as you can see in the general fund, which again pays for most police, fire, and public works services, 73%, that big blue portion, is for personnel costs. That includes not just salaries, but health insurance and pension costs and other related expenditures. Those expenditures are increasing very modestly. In fact, it's so small that you probably can't see the change on the chart. Most other categories of expenditures are decreasing, with total expenditures decreasing by $6.9 million. The reason for that big decrease is, in large part, the $5.26 million transfer of funds related to the disputed hospital property taxes to a general reserve fund, and that will happen in the current fiscal year. So that makes FY17 look larger than it normally would. Also, in the current fiscal year, we have $1.8 million in one-time transfers for capital improvement projects. Services are the second largest category of expenditures, and they're about 12.3% of the total. That's higher in FY17 and 18 due in part to one-time expenses for software implementation in finance and public works. So this slide is very interesting. This takes a closer look at the fund balance in our general operating fund, which again pays for most basic city services. So on this chart, the bars show the ending fund balance in the general fund, and the green line shows the council policy to have a fund balance that's 15% of recurring expenditures. So we're about $820,000 short of that goal in the FY18 proposed budget. Also, you can see that the fund balance declined significantly between FY16 and FY17. Again, this happens for several reasons: planned deficit spending, one-time transfers to pay for capital projects in the most part, and then revenues falling short of expectations. Also, the transfer of the $5.26 million out of the general fund at the end of this fiscal year. In order to provide comparability over time, I've shown the hospital property tax funds in blue at the top of the bar, and the remaining portion of fund balance in purple at the bottom. So as you can see, without those funds, even as far back as fiscal year 15, our fund balance would have been precipitously low, only $1.2 million. The fund balance grew considerably during FY16, primarily due to a planned surplus. Revenues were budgeted higher than expenditures, and then on top of that, revenues exceeded budget and expenditures were less than budget. So I guess in addition, there were some changes during the current fiscal year that also reduced fund balance. We committed to 3 new positions during the course of the fiscal year. 2 of those were police officers and 1 position in human relations. That increased our expenditures by about $300,000 on an annual basis. Again, our fund balance in the proposed budget is 12.5% of recurring expenditures. Our goal is 15%. So as the mayor indicated, we'll have to make some very strategic decisions over the next couple of years to bring that into line. We may also want to consider building the reserve further, particularly given potential fallout from the state's budget crisis. So looking at recurring expenditures in the general fund, you can see that recurring expenditures in FY17 are very close to recurring revenues. Again, that goes back to the 3 positions added during the fiscal year. There was more of a gap when we initially adopted the budget. So our estimate for FY17 is that our recurring expenditures and revenues are about even. The problem with this, even though it's compliant with our policy, is that at a time when revenues are very uncertain, if we have a revenue shortfall, we don't have enough revenue to fund our ongoing services. Recurring expenditures in the proposed budget have been reduced to 97.6% of recurring revenues. However, because of the structural deficit, because our revenues are growing more slowly than our expenditures, that probably is still not going to be sustainable over the long term.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So looking ahead, one of the things that we are developing for implementation this summer is a voluntary separation incentive program. This has been, programs like this have been implemented at the U of I and in the city of Champaign in past years. We expect this to result in some additional decreases in our recurring expenditures. We much prefer to focus on reducing staffing through a voluntary program. And it should provide some funds to help address long-term financial concerns and to help us build back our reserves. Probably one of the biggest challenges facing cities today in Illinois is the high level of uncertainty in the state. And if I had one message I could give to the Illinois General Assembly is help cities do our job by doing yours and passing a budget and starting to address these long-term financial challenges. But the fiscal challenges we face today in the city of Urbana are daunting, and I'm committed to facing them head on. And as we have pointed out, it's going to take some sacrifice on everyone's part from the top down, and it's going to take some very thoughtful planning and strategic decision making. But I am convinced that we can get ourselves on a sound financial footing. We have a lot of programs, we have services, we have many needs in this community, and if we're going to meet those needs, we have to be able to pay for them, and we have to have long-term financial stability to position us for the kind of growth and development we also want to see in our communities. So this budget represents a first step in that direction, and it is our foundation for a very good future, an excellent future in the city of Urbana. So we are going to be presenting the budget to City Council tonight, essentially the same presentation. Because there are so many, well, this is a departure from budget messages in the past. I've scheduled 7 budget briefing meetings for city employees. They'll take place this week. Morning, afternoon, and evening, so that we can explain the budget and answer questions directly. On May 22nd, we'll be hearing from Public Works Director on a city's capital improvement plan, and also from the Library Director on the library budget. On June 5th, there will be a public hearing on the budget, and Elizabeth will give a presentation to Council with more detail on our long-term funding challenges. And then on June 19th, we're scheduled to present the ordinance adopting the budget. So with that, I thank you for coming, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Mayor, could you talk a little bit more about the decrease in, I think you said, in sales taxes for the city? You've seen a decrease and you expect a decrease to continue. Do you know why? Is it something particular to Urbana, or is it something more widespread?
It's not particular to Urbana, and I'm going to defer to Elizabeth, who's been tracking this.
Yeah, it's definitely not particular to Urbana. There have been months, many months this year, where state taxes have been down across the state. So that trickles down to the local level. You know, of course, we did our homework and reviewed reports of sales taxes from various businesses in Urbana to see if, you know, there was something missing, but it's fairly widespread. And we think probably a large part of that is attributable to increasing use of internet sales. At the same time, we've seen an increase in our use tax, which is how we would receive taxes on internet sales. Unfortunately, it's not equal to the amount we're losing in sales tax because there is no home rule sales tax on those internet sales when they're reported to the state. Oh, and just to clarify, we're expecting a decrease this year. We're hoping for growth of 1% next year.
Okay, next year being,
Fiscal 2018, so the year that starts July 1.
okay.
So you're expecting a 1% growth?
Yes, yes.
The voluntary separation program, Mayor, how many, I guess, since 100 are eligible, how many employees do you need to participate in that to avoid potential future layoffs? You said you could potentially have to go that route.
I don't think we've determined a number yet, but as you said, 100 are could possibly be eligible.
Yeah, I think it depends in large part on how quickly and how fully we want to address those long-term funding issues that the mayor recommended. I mean, obviously, it would be painful, for example, to try and address the underfunding on the police and fire pensions, you know, all in 1 year. So we'll need to study those issues further and probably take a stepwise approach to addressing them.
So it doesn't necessarily need to happen in the fiscal year that starts July 1st, those voluntary separation.
No, we do intend to offer this in fiscal year
You don't
2018.
necessarily have to have them take effect in case other things fall into place.
Well, that would be part of our plan for this coming fiscal year.
I think it'll be necessary so we can begin to address those long-term funding issues.
How would you see the loss of that amount of city staff affecting government operations?
Oh, we're not talking about losing 100 people. The way these programs work, number one, they're voluntary. Number two, people, and I actually retired from the U of I under the VSIP program that was offered several years ago. Once people who decide if they want to apply for the program, then the department head in the city evaluates whether or not they are providing an essential service, whether or not we can afford to lose them, or whether or not we'll see the kinds of savings that we need. So it's a multi-step procedure. So there's no, I mean, potentially that pool of 100 people would be eligible to apply, but certainly not that many would be cut.
How many would you expect to see?
It's hard to say. You really don't know until you offer it. And I know my experience at the U of I, when I first learned about it, I figured, oh, it's everyone who's close to retirement might be someone who would consider this. But it turns out that it was actually provided an opportunity for people who may not have considered doing it. For example, one person in my department was very young. I think he was in his 30s, but he decided to take advantage of the program, use the compensation to go back to school and pay tuition. Couple other people had been thinking about doing something, changing careers, and this offered them the financial flexibility to allow them to do that. So it's voluntary. It offers an incentive, and you really can't predict, but it's a reasonable, certainly a much preferable way to go as far as when you're looking at having to reduce some staffing.
The financial situation that you're looking at, does that affect how the city council might look at, say, the proposal regarding the Urbana Lincoln Hotel?
Well, it's probably, yeah, it's going to factor in. It's going to factor into it.
I mean, it makes a difference to essentially means you have to have that it'll affect how much risk the city wants to take on, or how good the deal has to be for the city.
Yes, and again, the risk in the hotel proposal before us is on the general fund, which would be that's where the obligation to pay the bonds back would come out of. So we are looking very, very closely at the general fund.
So there is room for landmark in this budget?
No, that's not factored into this budget.
When does that come back to the city council?
I think we're scheduled for a briefing next week, but I'm not sure if that's going to continue.
Before the budget is settled.
Yeah.
Is this the first time the Carl money
Yes. And it's very important for, as part of my policy of being upfront and straightforward with the taxpayers, is to present a very clear picture of where we stand. And I don't think it was completely transparent to keep the Carl money in our showing as our reserves, because as I said, it's not ours to spend, potentially could be paid back. It's going to be years before this thing is resolved, but it's not ours to spend, and it shouldn't be shown as such.
So you're working on the assumption, although of course something could change at some point in the future, but you're working on the assumption that tax revenue from Carl is simply not there.
Well, it's clearly not there this year. I don't know what the future will bring. I just don't think we should be showing it as part of our general fund. It should be shown in a separate reserve fund, so that it's very clear to people what is the city's money to spend and what is not the city's money to spend at this time.
And does the city have legal counsel giving it an idea of where Carl is going to end up? Does it any predictions on how the next state of things or the next step of things will go?
We do have counsel representing the city and the township in that suit.
Or
Yeah.
city legal advisors telling you how they think Carl will finish up?
Well, no, we do have an attorney representing the city and the township.
Are you guys optimistic that it will end well with Carl?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been in office for 2 weeks, and it's pretty much been up to my eyeballs in the budget. I had one briefing on the Carl issue, and I certainly expect to get more. So the focus the last couple of weeks has been on getting this budget out, and certainly there's a couple of large looming issues. That includes Carl and the hotel going forward, but and we will be looking at that. But at this point, our goal was to get this budget out.
Do you have any expectations as to how your proposal will be received by the council?
Well, we'll see tonight. The council received an advance copy of the proposal in their packets on Thursday, so they've had the weekend to look it over, and as I said, we'll be doing this same presentation tonight, and then we'll be answering questions and responding to comments.
The budget is, proposed budget says 45.9, so what's the actual deficit right now? Is it 1.2, is that correct?
Are you talking about the general fund specifically?
Yes, the proposed $45.9 million budget. What's the deficit number?
So in the general fund specifically, we don't have technically a deficit, but in terms of fund balance, we're about $820,000 short of our goal based on our policy.
To get to the 15% number.
Right.
But what is the deficit just for the overall revenues versus expenditures?
Oh.
For this fiscal year coming up?
There's actually not a deficit between revenues and expenditures for the fiscal year coming up. There is in the current year, but we've addressed that in the budget process through expenditure reductions and that one revenue increase.
We propose a balanced budget.
The 45.9, what does that compare to in the previous year, I guess, the current fiscal year?
So on this chart, you can see this is expenditures for all funds. So 46 million, we rounded it off in this slide, 58.6 in the prior year. And it, as you can see again, when we look at all city funds, it can fluctuate quite a bit, and that's largely due to capital improvement expenditures. So it's a difficult comparison to make.
So the fiscal year is just about to end is 58.6, that was that budget?
That's our estimate, yeah.
Okay, that's one's gonna end in about 6 weeks.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask about something on page 11 of your budget. I didn't see you're adding some more police officers. This is saying police patrol funding will be going down to 47 to 45. I'm curious what kind of cuts that would entail.
Could you ask that question again?
Sorry. So on page 11 of the budget,
Mhm.
it's the numeric 11 It says that there is gonna be a decrease from 47 to 45. I was just curious what kind of cuts those are.
I think you might be reading that backwards. So it was
sorry.
it was increased from 45 to 47 during the current fiscal year, and it will remain at 47.
I know it's hard to predict, but is there an amount of money that you guys are hoping to save with the VSIP?
So I think that depends in large part on fleshing out those long-term funding concerns. But I think certainly just the gap on the pensions alone is going to exceed $1 million. Now, I don't think we're going to get all that savings at once over a long period of time. That's probably going to come from, being modest in our budgeting, making cuts where we can, and from growing revenues as well. But that's, again, they're long-term issues, so we're not going to fix that in 2018 and probably not in 2019.
Mayor, what is your timeline of getting a city administrator hired? I know that process takes time, there's application process.
Yeah, we'll be using a search firm. I hoped within 6 months.
Just have one hired in 6 months.
From today.
From this moment, yes.
Okay,
No, in approximately 6 months, I would hope. Yeah.
Any update on that one will come before the fire chief, right? That hire will happen first?
The administrator within 6 months.
Bless you. I don't
Yeah, we'll have more on that shortly. That one.
The community development director, which is Libby Tyler,
Mhm.
so she is retiring.
Mhm.
You're planning to kind of reorganize that department. What are your plans with that?
Well, we're going to be working with Libby to flesh that out, but it's maintaining all the services and certainly all the functions. It's just reorganizing with the existing staff. And eventually, my goal is to have the economic development staff report to the executive department, to the administrator. I really want to elevate the profile of economic development in this city, and as I said, the new administrator, one of their chief responsibilities will be to focus on economic development. So that's longer term.
So you don't see a replacement per se for somebody in Libby's position?
No.
What is that savings again?
It's about 140.
Yeah, about 140 annually.
Would it be creating new roles, that reorganization?
People will take on additional responsibilities and kind of reshuffle responsibilities.
So currently at this moment, there no plans for layoffs or anything like that, just the small increases you guys are representing.
Just what we have here.
The tax that you want to increase, how does that compare with what Champaign does in equivalent?
Go ahead.
Their food and beverage tax is currently 0.5%. Ours is currently 1%. So we will be at 1.5%, which is a full percent higher.
If you look at area cities, it ranges from 1 to 2% in cities of comparable size in the area.
1.5 compared to 0.5%. Do you see that, knowing that it has that sort of range in other towns, is it not a particular disadvantage to be that much higher?
Well, I hate raising taxes, period. I mean, this is the hardest part of this, one of the hardest part of it. But when you look at potential revenue sources, it's a tax. We have so many visitors in Champaign County. It's a tax that visitors to the community help pay, as do, for example, the food or the local motor fuel tax. So as far as having an impact on residents, individuals, this seemed to be a reasonable place to turn to.
I would also say that when we increased it a couple of years ago from 0.5% to 1%, our revenues more than doubled. So that tells me that nobody decided to go eat somewhere other than Urbana because our tax rate was 0.5 cent higher. Yeah, when you look at that chart again for all city funds, I'll put it back up there. I think that's what you're, no, that's more than 6.9. Oh, you're talking about this chart in the general fund. So the reason for that big decrease is partly because we have some large one-time expenditures in the fiscal 17 year that are happening. So that big blip, which is part of that, is it's a general fund expense to move the 5.26 million in disputed hospital property tax money to another fund. That's an expense in the general fund. So that's the biggest part of that. And also we had substantial one-time expenditures for capital improvement projects this year. So it's not so much that it's a decrease as that the current fiscal year is unusually high.
Okay.
Any other questions?
When, chief of staff, when's the retirement date for that, for Mike?
Technically, it's August, early August, okay.
And for Libby?
June 30th.
But you wouldn't expect, you're talking about not having an administrator, it sounds like fall, end of the year.
Yeah, early fall, I would hope, at the earliest. It takes a while.
But you'll have a couple months gap there where you won't have Mike or the administrator.
Possibly, yeah. Any other questions?
Maybe just one more about
Right.
the administrator, if you can talk in terms of vision. As, essentially how you see city government running with
Sure.
an administrator back in place.
Well, just as background, this position is provided in our city code, and the position has been essentially vacant for the past 10 years. And the administrator, as described in the code, and certainly as I envision it, would be someone with basically the skills of a city manager. I want someone who has economic development background. We have a lot of policies and procedures internally in the city that really need to be updated, and and in some cases, I think probably rewritten. So we have to rebuild. I think it's building our city internal infrastructure as well. It's not streets and sewers, but it's some of the policies and procedures, and doing a lot of the long-term planning that's necessary as well. For example, strategic planning would be one thing. So, and working closely with the council and mayor to really implement the policies and goals developed by the council and mayor. So I would see this person running the day-to-day operations of the city. And having been on the job for 2 weeks, I can 100% say with certainty, I cannot imagine doing it without an administrator in place. It's a very complex operation. We have 250 employees, multi-million-dollar budget, and we need professional administration at the helm.
Oh, I know you guys also mentioned when the 2 new police officers were hired, that you were thinking, there was the possibility thrown around of doing 3 more in the summer, or 3 more after the budget negotiations were done. Is that still?
Well, if you recall the proposal to add first of all, let me say, the goal would be to adequately staff our police department. There's no doubt about that. When the proposal to add 5 officers was first was proposed, the question immediately came to my mind was, how are we going to pay for this 5 new personnel line items? And we are committed to hiring the 2 for this year, and eventually the goal would be to increase that to the levels of adequate staffing, but we cannot afford to in this coming year to do 3 more. Yeah.
One thing I was wondering, you were talking about getting an administrator with the skills of the city manager,
Mm-hmm.
but this is still a different municipal structure.
Correct.
Say, a council-manager government.
It's a mayor-council form of government, but what, from what I've been reading, the National League of Cities, for example, has said that even cities with the mayor-council form of government, which is the minority, which is, most cities have a manager form of government. So our form of government is actually, we're kind of in the minority in terms of across the country. But even in cities with a mayor-council form of government, more and more and more cities are turning to professional administrators. Cities are different than they used to be, and they're increasingly complex and complicated. And I think best practices just includes professional administration, and our city will benefit tremendously from that.
Did you say it was about 10 years ago?
Approximately, yeah. Bruce Walden held that position. And I know people sometimes are worried that this will diminish the power of the mayor or the city council, and that's absolutely not the case. I think it will make us all much more effective, frankly, at getting done what we want to do and reaching our goals. And certainly getting the city on a firm financial footing and a firm structural footing as well.
Just to clarify, in this memo, the line that says one major revenue increase, that refers to the VSIP.
I think that refers to the food and beverage tax.
Food and beverage tax.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's like the fourth paragraph on this two-page memo.
The press release?
The press release.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions? If not, we'll wrap up.
Thank you all very much for coming. We'll see you tonight.